Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the second of the landscape and garden design with SketchUp overview. Part two. Thank you very much. If you sent me a note or said something very nice on social media yesterday, I really appreciate it. I didn't think it would be quite so popular. Now, yesterday was really basic. We were covering really the mechanics of what goes into allowing you to get started and starting to build your models without having to keep going back every time you open SketchUp and make changes. Today, we're really, I realize I've got the wrong slide up. It says part one, it's part two, my mistake. But what we are looking at today is obviously part two, and building SketchUp models for landscape and garden design that are aimed at presentation models. So models that you might show the client, they're more SketchUp models. They're not final. They're about getting something that you can talk about, play around with. They're not fixed, they're quite fluid. They're not looking at accuracy in terms of nailing down wall thicknesses and exact step ratios. It's about putting ideas on paper and then having something at the end of it which is presentable. I can only go so far in an hour. Hand on heart, I have set up a few things in advance, but I will explain just because they're going to hopefully save time and some repetitive action. But everything that's unique, I will show at least once. So I'm going to get right into it. And let me just close this down. There were some questions yesterday about, will this be recorded? Yes, yesterday's was recorded, and the subsequent today and Monday and Tuesdays will be recorded, and you will get notification from Elmtech and SketchUp about when those are being posted to YouTube. I'm going to be doing a couple of things, and you will probably have questions relating to things like textures and plants. Feel free to ask, but I will issue a crib sheet, and that will go on the YouTube panel notes, but hopefully you'll also get that crib sheet mailed to you. Unfortunately, you won't get it today. It'll be at the end of the series, so it'll be an overview. But hopefully it's all self-explanatory, and I'm hoping that you've already found out some of these things anyway. Great. I've opened up the template that I was using yesterday. So I've got my icons in place. Laura's got my working scene by default, and I've got some layers, or tags, I should call them. So the first thing I'm going to do is, well, in fact, the first thing to do is decide what you want your computer model to do for you. You cannot and should not assume that your SketchUp model that you create right at the beginning of a project is going to be the one which you end up with. You're not going to have a model that you just keep modifying and improving and it remains the same file. If you think about your paper workflow, you will have done a sketch and then a different sketch, and you may do some on tracing paper and regular paper. You may do something in the computer. You may do a planting plan on a sketch. You may then draw it up and then change it and make a copy and draw it up again. And you end up with a pile of paper, lots of versions and experimentation, which gets you to one point, a individual unique document. And computer modeling is the same. You should use the same workflow, that you experiment and create something, and then don't be afraid to archive it and start a new session of SketchUp. You can copy and paste models into other sessions of SketchUp and build on them and reference them, but you're very likely to have multiple versions and multiple models that help you pull it all together towards a complete project. So the first thing I'm going to suggest, I can't tell you much more than this, is have a really good naming structure. Don't call it final model or pergola model. You know, if you're going to model a pergola, then give it a name, give it a date. Make sure that you can identify it from any other versions. Talk about naming structures some other time. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm assuming that we've already designed something for our garden. And in this case, I've done a sketch, a really rough, simple, it's not the greatest piece of garden design, but you get the idea that you can import sketches that you've done, maybe over the survey, whether it's a commercial survey or your own survey. You spent time with a piece of paper and tracing paper, and now you want to get that into SketchUp. You can draw straight into SketchUp, and I frequently do, but using pencil, paper, and pens it can be a joy. So it allows you to work away from a computer. The first thing we do is import this sketch. Now, the sketch needs to have been saved as something like a JPEG, and that's easily done because you can scan it. Scan output is usually PDF or JPEG. JPEG will come in better than the PDF, but if you draw quite large, over A3, you're going to have trouble scanning because you might not be convenient to go off to the printers and get scanned there. Easy way around that is stick it to the wall, get a camera, get your phone, and photograph it on the wall. Don't worry about any color casts from artificial light or shadows. You're really just looking at the underlying geometry. So I'm going to go File, Import. And I'm going to go and look for the folder. And I think it's in my documents. Oops, I've got so many windows open. And wherever green zone is. And then I've got talks, 2020 talks, webinar, and I thought I had, bear with me, I seem to have, that's because I'm looking in completely the wrong place. Date added, here we go. Sketch. So I'm looking for the sketch that I've done. At the bottom of my screen, Mac and PC, same selection, slightly different locations, but I've got an options, and it's the way I bring something in. So I'm going to make sure it says all supported image types. It may have defaulted to something like DXF or PDF. So I pick all supported image types because that gives me a one-click view on lots of different types of files. So I'm looking for a JPEG, which is here. And I've got to decide whether I'm bringing this in as a texture, a new match photo, or an image. At this stage, it's quite rare that you will use new match photo. So most of the time you're going to bring in as an image or a texture. And the way to differentiate is if you're going to paint an existing piece of geometry with a photograph or a texture, as we will later, it's a texture, it's paint. If it's anything else, then it's very likely to be an image. So I'm going to pick image, and then I'm going to say import. Try again. I've got so many controls open, so file, okay, that's struggling. As it happens, I don't know, that might be something whether it's in concrete is the perimeter of the rectangle. When you have drawn your sketch, you will know the dimension. And so don't forget usually it helps if this is something like the back of a building or a very defined length of the garden. So I'm going to assume that we know the back of the building as being 5.67 as a random size geometry. When you place the sketch in SketchUp, by default, it will lie on the ground plane and it will be some size. It will be proportional, but you won't know if it's the right size or not. And the way we fix that is I'm going to flip to a plan view, which in my icons is up at the top, and it's the top-down view. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to use the tape measure tool. Lots of keyboard shortcuts in SketchUp, really useful if you download or go to Google and just hit keyboard shortcuts, SketchUp 2020. There are loads of downloads on PDF, on A3 and A4, but really you can memorize most of them because they're single letters, so T for tape measure. And I'm going to pick this corner here, and I'm going to pick this corner here, and I've let go of my mouse. So I'm not clicking anything else. And if you look at the bottom right hand of my screen, I'm going to type 5.67, and then I'm going to hit return. And this window appears saying, do I want to resize the model? And the answer is yes. If this window does not appear, it means you probably measured and then clicked again. So go back and repeat the process. The answer is yes, and it was almost the right size, so you might have seen it jump. But now if I go back in and measure, it's 5.68. It depends. There we go. It's spot on. So now I have resized my geometry, my import geometry, to be a full-size model. It's not going to hang around for very long, but we're going to draw over it. It's useful if you have a layer structure, or tag structure, I should say, already set up. So I've got one over on the right-hand side, and one of the things I've got is imported sketch. So I would take this geometry, I would go to the tag, select imported sketch, and then that would assign it to that tag so that I can switch it off when I need to. So I'm going to keep it switched on at the moment. The other thing I've done, which is I've set up a scene. One is working scene, which is a three-dimensional ready to start modeling, and one called sketch plan. And all I did was view, animation, add scene. It creates scene 3. I give it a name by hitting the right-hand button of my mouse to say rename. I'm going to delete it. And called sketch plan. So you set up the orientation that you want. You want the top-down view, and then you almost photograph all of the settings. You capture them by going view, animation, add scene. So this is a top-down view, and I just need to start drawing. I've kept things really simple for myself. We've got a rectangular garden, got the house at the bottom, some kind of patio area, got some steps going up. We've got a recessed area for plants at ground level, a kind of zigzagging retaining wall. And once we get to the top, we're probably going to have planting and a little bit of lawn. And we may add a shed. So this is really simple. I'm going to draw a rectangle over the whole geometry. Now, that's obliterated my geometry. SketchUp has a feature called X-ray, and that is at the end of this little series of cubes. And if I hit it, it makes the geometry that I'm creating semi-transparent. By creating a plane first, it sets a piece of geometry in the orientation that I want to build off. And because SketchUp has this feature where geometry likes to stick to other geometry, this acts as a drawing plane. And I'm going to make sure that anything I draw is on the plane rather than trying to rush it and accidentally creating things off plane, which really won't show up until I'm much further down the line. Now, I've got rectangle tools, I've got drawing tools, I've got arc tools, but most of the time I'm going to be using the pencil and the rectangle tool. So I'm going to start drawing over my shape. I am an advocate of using guides. Some people don't like to use them. It's a personal preference. But the tape measure tool has two functions. If I click on it, it will measure, as we did at the beginning, between 2 points and create what is essentially a temporary dimension. But the other function is if I hover over a line, and in this case, the edge of my drawing, not in the middle and not at the end, but somewhere on the line itself, if I click, leave it for about a second and drag one side or the other, it will drag a line parallel to the edge that I selected. And think of this as if you're using a drawing board and you wanted to create a construction or a ghost line in preparation for doing your inking in. So it's a dotted line. We will get rid of them shortly, but I'm simply going to place it right at the edge, and that gives me a reference for the edge of my garden. The next thing I'm going to do is draw in the house. So really quickly, I can pick. Geometry will snap onto this construction line, so I can click and drag. I'm not really bothered about the depth of the house. And oops, there is my house. Now it's been split because I drew over the edge. So I'm just going to erase, whoops, going to erase that line. So my house, if I drag it up, is at the moment, we're just going to keep it a cube because we're really focusing on the garden, but usually it's about the ease line of a house is about between 5.5 and 6 meters. So I'm going to keep that, and then I'm just going to erase these stray lines. Go back to my sketch plan. Oh, my imported sketch seems to have disappeared. How strange. This is, oh, there it is. Right, that's why. Okay, it defaulted and switched my X-ray mode back on. I'm going to pick the house. So I'm just going to make sure that I select all of the geometry for the house. There's a little line there I don't need. And I'm going to make that into a group. We'll come on to groups afterwards, but grouping geometry means that it doesn't interact with other geometry. So as I start to build my garden, I can decide to switch off my house. So the workflow in SketchUp is in 3 parts. You basically make geometry of the thing that you want, not necessarily the entire cityscape or the entire garden, but of the components that you want within the garden. And then you group them, and then you put them on their own tag. And you can then switch them on and off as you need. And that becomes much more efficient later on when you have got lots of objects on screen that you don't really need. They're starting to slow things down. You can switch off the trees, you can switch off the furniture, the planters. I don't need the house, but I will need it later on, maybe when I'm doing some kind of presentation. So the workflow, make geometry, make group, put it onto its own tag. So I've made this rather basic cube. So immediately it's going to get in the way. So I'm going to add GZ house. I'm going to pick this object. It's blue. I'm going to go up to the tag, and then I'm going to select the tag I want it to be associated with, which is house. And then when I take away the little I symbol, switch it off, that disappears. So now that has been put away. So I'm going to carry on with my garden. Switch off the house. this is going to be based on a whole series of rectangles. So I'm going to draw a line across the garden. I could use the tape measure tool to create a guideline, but sometimes it can be quicker to start building up things with rectangles. So it might be that I pick this point, or this point, or this point, and then just start laying out geometry. But here I'm going to go and draw up to here. When I do sketches, I'm obviously not being very careful, so I'm correcting some of the geometry as I go, assuming that the edge of this feature, which is a plan view of a planted bed, lines up with the geometry that I'm creating for the top of my steps as they turn round. I want the same to happen here. I want this edge to line up with the house, and maybe I will create a guideline. I wasn't too far off there. Maybe I'll create a guideline here. Now at this stage, I'm not going to be particularly careful and apply real world building dimensions because I actually don't know what they will be. I know how to build a wall, but if this wall's made of brick or block or made with facing stone, depending on what it's made of, the thickness will vary. And we haven't got that far down the line yet. So I'm going to go with standard real world dimensions, but ultimately they may be the wrong dimensions, but I can change them later. I don't think that makes too much of an impact. I want to get this model in front of a client, and really the client's interested in where the steps are and what the proposed design is, rather than that wall looks like it needs to be 15 millimeters thicker. So I wouldn't worry because there is a second model in the workflow. And that's what we're going to be looking at Monday, where you take this initial model and then start to apply the right details and the right construction techniques, and then extract them with a view to setting out a whole load of drawings. So I'm really going to take this wall here. I'm going to go with 300 millimeters. So I'm going to drag down 0.3, and then I'm going to drag in here 0.3. Now, the last dimension I entered was 0.3. So when I click on this line and drag up, it snaps to the last input. So it doesn't take very long to start building up. Now, I don't have a construction dimension line through here, so I drag that one and place it here. And then I'm going to have to offset, but I didn't input the first line, it was just a guess. So it still snaps back to the 300. The same with this. I'm going to put this line about here, and then this one will snap to 0.3. And then I'm going to drag down to about here. Now, as I'm dragging down, it's telling me it's about 900, which was my intention, because 900 wide steps are reasonable, and I know that several stone manufacturers produce treads that are 900 millimeters wide. If you want it to be a meter, again, one of those things, I'll go with the standard dimension and we'll correct it later. Do not try and drag down and move it and nudge it until you get 900. Drag it down approximately in the right direction, let go, type 0.9, and it will snap to the right position. And then when I drag down, it will no longer snap to 0.3 because the last input was 900. So I'm going to have to go 0.3. And I've got lots of little construction lines all over the place. So what I need to do is stop myself getting confused and start drawing in some of this stuff. Easiest way is to use the rectangle tool. And I'm just going to start drawing in. I'm probably going to draw in more geometry than I need, and then I can erase it later. So I'm going to draw in there, draw in that one, draw in the front of my wall, draw up here, draw in there. I've got a line that goes across here. That line goes there. This is obviously part of a garden, so I'll go all the way to the end, but we'll work out maybe what we're doing later. And at the moment, I'm not quite sure where I want that bed to be. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a construction line off the edge of this path, drag it across, and I'm going to go 1.2 because that would seem to be a nice width of path. And I may need to make my bed a bit thicker, a bit wider. So lots of stuff going on here. Last one, I'm going to drag a line across this, and it's snapped to 1.2. So I'm probably going to go 0.9 here. So I'm adjusting the sketch because I've made the realization that maybe it's better to keep all my steps the same width. And then I'm simply going to draw that all the way down to here. I know my wall now goes through my gate, but we'll make that adjustment later on when we're working on that end of the garden. So lots of lines going on here. First thing I'm going to do is use the erase tool, click to one side of a line and drag across. And I can then do that for multiple lines. Don't do it too fast, otherwise your mouse will skip over a few. I'm going to zoom out. It is essential when using SketchUp to use a 3-button mouse. And that is really a mouse with a split down the middle. It's got a definitive left-hand button, right-hand button, and a wheel in the middle. And the wheel, you can use a mouse that actually isn't pressable. You mouse, and obviously, and if you turn on the wheel, orbit, and zoom, can really help with that. You start to become more. Versions do not work very well with gestures, and you may have to supplement the gestures by orbit and use the icon for that. They're not expensive. A really good one, probably about £20. A really, really good one, about £40. But you can, cheap ones work just as well. So I'm just going to go back to my sketch plan. And I think I'm ready to start turning this into something a bit more meaningful. So I'm going to switch off my imported sketch. And there is my garden. This is obviously the footprint of the house. And I've got some steps going up here, and I've got some steps going up here. So I'm really just recreating the garden plan with accurate geometry using SketchUp. So SketchUp is a very good drafting tool. If you happen to use something like Vectorworks and want to do the 3D in SketchUp, yes, you can import a Vectorworks line drawing as a DWG, and Vectorworks produces very good DWGs, so you can almost create the geometry immediately from the imported line work. Not quite so easy, and that's something we might cover on another day. So what I need to do is just divide these spaces in with some steps. So I'm going to make my landing. Hopefully it will all become clear if you're wondering what I'm actually doing. I'm going to put in, I don't know, 3 steps here and then 3 steps here. And then I can work out the ratio. I'm assuming a standard ratio just for the purposes of this exercise. But when you're designing this, you would know what the actual change of level would be and would create your steps to be a unit that evenly divides into that change of level. But I can pick this line, and SketchUp's got a really neat feature. If I, right-hand click, it says divide, and then I just move my mouse in one direction or the other, and it will equally divide into, in this case, 3 line segments. So I just click, I can then pick that line segment and draw across. And one of the things I absolutely love about SketchUp is it saves me doing a lot of mathematical work. Whilst I like maths, I don't like having a notepad with a calculator having to work out what is a third of this line. So these little tools really help. Now I don't have that luxury here because I've got a really long line and I want to basically just repeat that geometry over here. So I'm just going to measure whatever that was, which was 7.34, and I'm going to offset that 0.734. I can draw that line in, and then I'm going to copy that 2 more times. If I pick this line, if I select the move tool, M for move on the keyboard shortcuts, I'm not going to pick this point because then I'd have to work out where it's going to go and I'd have to input that distance. So to save me doing all of that, if I pick this point and then hit Control on the Alt on a Mac, it puts a little plus symbol on the end. When I click and move, so I'm going to click from this point to this point, and when it snaps here, it's moved that line proportional to the point as a fixed ratio from the line that I originally selected. And so I've done it once, and if I hit ×2, it will do it a second time automatically. So now I've got some steps, and I realize I don't have an edge to my top garden, and I don't have an edge down here. And I'm probably going to delete these lines down here because I don't need them. Right, ready to go into 3D. Need to save. SketchUp has an auto-save every 5 minutes. And what I realized I should have done right at the beginning, before you even start modeling, the critical thing to do in SketchUp is empty session of SketchUp, file save. So you've done nothing, and then you save and your session of SketchUp that you intend to start modeling to the destination that you want. So I'm going to say file save, and then it's saving it to my folder, webinar 2 garden model. That way, SketchUp establishes a path to the destination that you want. If you don't, and carry on as I've just done, I'm taking a hit here for you, just so that you can see what the problem might be, is I've been modeling for more than 5 minutes, so SketchUp will probably try to create a default backup file. And the only way it can create the default backup file, potentially, is in the last location that you save something, which may have had nothing to do with SketchUp. So it could start saving your backup file in a completely different destination to where you actually want it to be, and away from the destination where you actually will start saving your models to. And that can cause all kinds of problems because, one, you might not know where they are, and secondly, if it ever crashes, then you're going to struggle to locate. And then if you start moving files around, the link gets broken, so you have to really create a manual backup file. So to save yourself all of those trouble, immediately save SketchUp, and that will give SketchUp the destination next door. It'll be right next to your original file, and it'll have a little wavy line, and that will be the backup version. Don't rely on the backup version to save your ass if it all goes wrong. So we've now reached the end of a nice phase. We've done some work. We're about to start a whole different type of work, file save. Golden rule when you're using computers, you save before you do, and then you save when you have done. Even if you're about to do one thing, if it all goes horribly wrong, then you've got something to go back to and try again or in a different way. 3D. There's a tool over here. There's some chunky arrows right in the middle, and they form a cluster, and these are all about moving geometry. I'm going to pick this one here. It's a box with a big arrow coming out of it. If I hover over, it's called the push-pull, and you'll see the little P, which is the keyboard shortcut. Really simple to remember. So I'm going to start by just lifting up my steps 0.15. I'm working in meters. I'm going to switch X-ray off because we know we don't really need our underlying geometry. Push-pull has some features that if you don't quite understand what it's doing, you might think it's frustrating or not doing something correctly. So I've just lifted up this geometry. I'm going to lift this one up, and I can't lift it any higher. As I drag up, it snaps and locks to the geometry that's adjoining it, which at the moment is saying 0.15. So these two are now even. And you wanted to drag it up 0.3. And when I do this one, it does the same. You should think of that as a benefit, not a hindrance, because when it drags the geometry up, it immediately resets its position. So this now thinks it's lying at the same level. So if I drag this up, all I've got to do is type 0.15. And I drag this one up, and it snaps to there, and I drag it up again, and I go 0.15, which means the only dimension I have to remember is 0.15. 0.15 is easy because we can work out multiples if I was trying to drag all these up simultaneously. But if, as in reality, our step treads are 0.163, what you don't want to be doing is recalculating every time you're lifting up to find out what 3 times 1.63 is, etc. So it will reset when it lands at the previous or the first step, and then you just drag it up 0.163. So this one will come here, drag it up 0.15, drag it up 0.15, drag it up, and then 0.15, and drag that one up. Right. So there are my steps. Now, I've got some retaining walls, so I'm going to start pulling those up, and they will do the same. They will snap to each step. So I just drag it up, and I'm going to go with this wall being maybe level with this step. But as I drag up, it's waiting for me to decide where I want to put it. If I move my mouse and touch the surface, the edge, or a corner of any geometry, it could be over here, but of this step, these two will now be at the same level. I'm going to drag this one up. It will snap to the geometry, but I want this one to be a bit higher. And I might drag this one up again later. I'm not quite sure. This one, I'm going to drag up to this height, this one to this height, this one to this height. Now, this is the bed in here. So I'm going to drag that up to the top, and this one I'm going to drag up. So this one needs to be a bit higher. And I'm now realizing I've got a change of level here. So maybe what I want to do is actually probably have this and drag that up to there, which means I need my retaining wall. And I'm really trying to show you that you can have an idea of what something looks like, but until you start pulling it into 3 dimensions, your appreciation of some of the problems and complexities really aren't clarified. And it's only in 3D that you can start to think, that's not going to quite work, but you can explore the alternatives. So I'm going to drag this one up. Now, this did what I wanted it to do. Was this one went white and all of these are blue. And that's because geometry in SketchUp, if I draw a rectangle here, has 2 surfaces. It has one surface and another one. And one's this blue purpley color and one's white. And it's because it's like a piece of paper, infinitely thin, but you can have a different surface on each side. And that simply means that for whatever reason, as the geometry was dragged up, it flipped the surface. And in the early stages of modeling, that presents no problem whatsoever, because if you start to apply textures, the textures will take away the underlying color of the surface and apply whatever it is that you want on top. But if you are pedantic, and certainly if you're going to get into things like 3D printing, all your surfaces need to face the same direction. So they need to face outwards. And we do that by clicking on a surface and then right-hand click, reverse faces, and it flips the surface. We won't get into what surface needs to be up or down, depending on 3D printing today. I'm just going to drag this up, and then I'm going to drag this up maybe to here. So we've got a change of level here. Maybe I'll drag that down to the same height. So not quite sure what I'm going to do there. I could drag this out, and if I wanted it to stop at one of my steps, I could have it here. And maybe I drag that down to that step. And maybe that looks a bit better. Now, when I'm dragging and push-pulling all of these surfaces, I'm getting these little scars, these lines, because the line was originally divided. As I drag up, the divisions are themselves extended into 3D onto the surfaces. And I don't need them. This is all one surface. So I'm just going to clean up some geometry. So I'm just going to take out all these lines. Don't need them on the sides. And this will help me apply textures much quicker and more accurately. And I've got one there. So simplistically, that's my model. I realize that I've got a large bed here. This is paving, and I've got some kind of recess area here, and that paving flow through. And I think I had a bed over here. So this is going to be bed, this is going to be bed, maybe this is lawn, maybe we'll put a shed at this end. We're probably going to put a pot here, tree here. So I'm going to start to build this up into something a little bit more interesting. So we've done something, we've now taken our geometry into its basic three-dimensional form. So now would be another good time to say save. I'm just going to quickly add some very small details. Now, steps that are just up and down like this, a bit like Lego, are rather dull. They don't cast very good shadows. And what we're trying to do is make this look as presentable as possible without necessarily going into a render engine and then spending another couple of hours in there. So you can get very, very good presentations out of SketchUp itself. You just need to do a couple of things. And one of the things is give your geometry a little bit more character so that it represents what's going on in reality, even if it's not specifically correct. So a good example was most steps have nosings, they have an overhang. So I'm going to simply draw a line somewhere about here. I could be really accurate about this, and I've split this surface, and I can now pull this out a fraction, but I'm not going to because I need to repeat this on all of these steps. So I'm going to do what I did before. I'm going to select this line, I'm going to hit the move icon, I'm going to hit the Alt key or Control key on a PC, click that corner, and when I drag it and place it there, the line is copied, and I need, including the one that I've moved, I need 3 of these, so type 3, and it moves that line up. And I know that it's worked because if I click the surface, that line should have divided the surface into 2, and therefore that is available to push-pull. Now, whilst I'm here, I'm going to do exactly the same up here, draw my line across, pick my line, move icon, click the corner, and there we go, pick there, and I only need 2 this time. Starting at the top, I'm going to pull out 0.03, 30 millimeters. So I get that overhang. And I could do the same on all of them, but SketchUp has this inferencing system. It remembers what I did last time. So if I double click on the nosing, it repeats the push-pull activity that I've just done. And there we've got some steps. And suddenly they look a little bit more interesting. Planting is never to the brim of a wall or adjoining paving. So a little trick is just to push it down slightly. And likewise, this is going to be planted, this is going to be lawn. So I can just drop that down visually, or as I'm pushing it down, I can come over here and touch, and these two will be the same, and the same on this bed. I probably want planting in here just for the sake of it, or no, in fact, I'm going to put some pots on there. And what I'm probably going to do is, oops, drag that across to maybe here. And then I can push that down. And this is going to be planting, and that's going to have a couple of pots on the top. So if I just, oops, drag that down, and then there's a bed that goes across here. Push that down and touch that one. And now I've got something that looks a little bit more three-dimensional. What you will notice is I'm not building groups, and I have a very specific reason for doing that. There are two schools of thought with this, and you can follow either. But with initial landscapes, I treat the entire ground as one group. And by ground, I mean ground, paving, walling, steps. If there's a water feature in the ground, it would be part of the ground. And I then triple click it, make it into a group, put it onto its own tag, and I usually call that tag garden ground, so that I can then switch that off if I need to. Oops, house and ground. Everything else that I bring in, I make separate, and I then make it into its own group, and that goes onto its own layer. So a good example of that is something I have prepared earlier, is a shed. And I'm really keeping this shed simple, so no apologies. So this is a little tiny shed. It looks a bit like a Wendy house. And I've just made this, and you can see that it's all loose geometry. This has not been grouped. This is as you would just push pull and then give it a bit of a pointed roof. If I make a plane, this itself is a piece of geometry made up of a surface and some edges. If I put this geometry and move it into position over here, I then go away, do something somewhere else, and at some point in the future, I think I want to move this. So if I pick that geometry, I'm being rather dramatic, but these two pieces of geometry have welded, they fused together because both of them were ungrouped. And then when you bring two pieces of ungrouped geometry together, they stick, they want to join. The way around that, and I've just stepped backwards using probably the most used keyboard shortcuts, which is Control Z on a PC or Command Z on a Mac. But the way to stop this happening is you make one or both of these into a group. So I can draw a box around it, but I prefer to triple click, make group. And this puts a box, a sort of invisible Perspex container. And this now, whilst you can snap to the geometry, does not interact. And this will slide around without causing any problems to the underlying geometry. The logic of making groups is if there is an item in the real world that is an entity with a name, like a shed, even though the shed may be made up itself of lots of pieces, I would construct the shed and then select all the geometry and make it into a group. If I had a pergola, which is made up of uprights and horizontals and lots of other pieces, I would make the whole pergola a group. Each of the uprights and pieces of timbers may themselves be made up of a collection of rectangles that make a group. And you can have groups within groups within groups. But each entity, table and chairs, the table will be a group, the chair will be a group, you make copies, and then you select all the chairs and the table, and you make the entire assembly a group. So that when you select it, you can move everything together. The great thing about that is you can also assign it onto its own tag. So I've got one called shed, and then I can switch the shed layer off, and I know it's going to behave and not switch off some of the geometry that it's stuck to when I put it in place. And we do that for everything. So you should end up with a list of items that really comprise the things typically in a garden. Now, coming back to why I keep the garden as a single group. This changes later on in the process when I start to break up the model into more detailed parts, and each of those parts is a group at the smallest level, which we'll talk about on Monday. But here, I'm after speed. And if the client wants me to alter something, they want the steps wider, I can just come into this model, pick it, move it. So I can adjust things much quicker. If each of these elements was grouped, I could then pick the steps and move them, and then I would have to patch the bit that was left behind, and it swings and roundabouts. I err on this side. Maybe for larger sites and more complex models, I would have to make each of these elements as a group. But certainly for small, simple structures, then give it a go and see if it works for you. Right, I can't believe we've been going for 40 minutes. I'm going to make this look a little bit more interesting. So I'm going to apply some textures. Now, textures are in the paint buckets. B for buckets opens up a panel. And SketchUp has a default library. I'm just going to go to walling. I'm just going to open up this group, because you need to apply textures to individual surfaces, not the entire unit. So I'm going to double click into a group, so now I can select things. If I go into walling, cladding, here we go, I can pick a nice stone texture and simply start to apply it. It's okay, but everybody else is using the same walling texture, and there's only there's probably 4 brick textures and 1 paving texture that's really of much use. So I use different textures almost all the time. So I am just going to switch on my layer, and here we go. These are textures that I've imported into SketchUp, and I use a website. I'll give you the link, but I'll just very quickly go there, which is SketchUptexture.com. Sorry, textureclub.com. And the way it works is really all of the textures are divided into these categories: architecture, materials, natural elements. And just under architecture, they've got 15,500 textures. And if I very quickly go through and look at, I don't know, outdoor paving, 1,620. And they're just in these subcategories, and you just have to keep scrolling through. So I'm not going to bore you, but you simply pick a texture, press download, and it lands in your downloads folder, and then you import as a texture. So exactly the same way that you imported the sketch at the beginning, but instead of picking image, you pick texture. So I'm just going to close that down. So how does this work? When you import them, you apply it directly onto your geometry. But in this case, I created a series of little panels, and I apply the texture to them, which means that I can use my paint bucket. And if I hold down the Command key on a Mac, or whatever the key immediately to the left of the spacebar is on a PC, it changes to an eyedropper. and I can pick and sample a texture, and it applies it to the geometry. And these textures are much better. As you can see, I'm zooming in. They're really good. They're not that large. They won't bloat your model. And I can just apply that texture to my model. Now, as I go up here, I want my texture to run the other way. So what I need to do is pick my texture, right-hand click with my mouse, position. I only ever use the green one. The others are really for distorting texture. And the green one allows me to rotate the texture, and then I can move it closer or further away from the red. So it will scale it, let go, and then I can resample this texture and carry on painting it as we go up. If I click the texture, I don't really like that little gap there, so I can now, texture position. I don't need to hit the pins. I can move it with a little fist symbol and just maybe make it a better fit. I'm going to pick a different wall texture. So I'm just going to go back to my paint bucket and pick this wall texture. Now, isn't that better? You might not like the style, but I was going for more of a Midlands Northern style garden. In this case, I'm just painting the top of the wall. I'm also going to paint the little bits at the back. Excuse me. I'm not going to get all of this finished, but you get the idea. Don't forget that wall, this wall, maybe this platform, this wall. Ooh, okay. Better. That one. I'm also going to paint the treads. Now you've got a choice. You can make the risers. The risers can be the same as your paving material. And what I realize I probably need to do is pick that texture and apply it to the front. For those of you who notice, you will see that the texture wraps itself around correctly, and that joint automatically lines up. And I've just noticed something, and I shout about it when I look at other people's work, so I don't want you shouting about it to me. That little slither there is dangerous. That could break off. I know it's only illustrative, but that's not the point. So I'm just going to pick and drag my texture back. So now it's corrected. And I've probably got another one at the top. And one more. I'm just going to pick that texture and apply it here. And maybe I'll just apply it there as well. So it's starting to look a little bit more interesting. I could go to the warehouse and start to download objects. As it happens, I've already downloaded some in advance because I did a little bit of prep. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go and get a tree very quickly. It takes a few seconds, but I'm going to go to my contents. So this is why it's important to do a little bit of homework. I'm going to go to my folders, and I've got some trees, not under general, which is the title page, but into the model, and I'm going to pick this tree here. So pick the tree, download it. Do I want it into the model? Yes. I have 3 bytes, and I was telling you yesterday to concentrate on models around 2, but just for the sake of speed, I'm going to put this here. Double click, this comes in as a component, which is a form of group. So it is editable. Bit big for my garden, I think. So if I click this, I've got the option to scale. And I get these 3-dimensional handles, and I can uniformly scale. Now, when I do that, obviously it distorts the shape. So I may have to reposition my geometry. So easy to bring things in, but I've already got some brought in. So I've got some furniture, and I've got some planters. So if I want my planters, I can just select them, when you're moving objects, pick the bottom, and that way it will land on the surface that you've picked. So I want to create an array here. So I can pick this. In this case, I'm not going to go move it to here and repeat it 3 times. I'm going to move one quite close to the edge and then hit the divide by 3, and it equally spaces my components across there. And then I might take one of these and simply copy from this position over to here. And I want this one to be a nice big one, so I could hit the scale and maybe just, oops, drag that one. It's a bit tall, so maybe I'll squash it down a bit and maybe make it a bit bigger still. So it becomes a chunky focal point. And the last thing is, I've got them here somewhere, which is plants. So I don't need my imported textures. Be very careful with plants. I'm really going to really talk about them for about 1 minute. But with plants, these are partially taken from the warehouse. Find yourself some good plants. I've got a list in my crib sheet of sites with plants. But inevitably, with these things, the better the plants, you're going to have to maybe pay or subscribe to websites where you can get them from. So there's half a dozen at least that are pretty good. These ones are a mixture from the warehouse and a couple of those websites. And the trick with plants is you pick them from the bottom. And then when you place them, they will snap to the surface. And do not try and plant a garden as if it was simply a collection of 40 or 50 or 100 different species. It will slow your model down so much it won't be worth using. But what you can do is take this model, for instance, and maybe randomly copy it. There is a very neat plugin that does all of this automatically for you. And I can then maybe simply scale one plant, and it gives it a little bit more variety. And it's at this stage, I'm really trying to indicate to the client that in this area, we've got some plants. What they are is something that we will determine a little bit later on. So I can maybe make some smaller ferns and move them into position. And I'm just randomly, as I said, there's a plugin I use that allows me to place a load of plants and it will randomly rotate and scale and do all of those things. And then when I switch on shadows, it starts to look a bit more interesting. So I've put some plants in here, but because we've used different textures, it's got a different feeling to it. And I think I've got one thing here. Just going to switch on. There we go. It can help as well if when you're doing slightly closer shots and you want something a little bit more interesting in the background, all I've done is this. Created a very, very, very large rectangle and imported a picture of a sky and pasted it in place. It's a bit crude, and there are ways of refining it, but if you're doing shots of gardens and you can't see the edges of the garden, and you probably have fence panels here as well, but it's a way of really just simplistically putting in, unless you're very happy with a white background. Now, the structure here is, sorry to repeat the point, make the geometry, put it into a group, put it onto a tag, and build something quick, easy, and expressive. I could literally just take that model, copy and paste it, and make an alternative. If the client goes, I prefer the steps to be on the left-hand side, it's going to be on the red. I can flip the model and then start to edit it. So I'm not precious about it. This is a sketch, and I'm really trying to get as close as I can to show the client. I frequently take these models and then put them into a render engine to really enhance them. And I do have a webinar of my own on Monday, which covers that technique. Just last tip is my model is going not as fast as I would expect it. And I've got quite a good processor. So always switch off plants, switch off objects that you don't need, like furniture. Switch off the textures. It's quite easy to model with the underlying tone, but not the texture, and switch off shadows. And this tree just needs to be put onto its own layer. So I've already got a layer for trees set up. And now it's much, much faster. Maybe I'll move my planters. And that way I don't necessarily need to see all my objects at the same time. And it doesn't need to be pretty whilst I'm working on it. That's really about setting up scenes and creating viewpoints that make it ready for export. The way I do that is you set up the scene that you want, the way you want it to look on screen, switch on your shadows, switch on your textures, switch on your objects. You want your tree, you want your shed, you want your plants, you want your furniture, you want your textures, you want your shadows, and then simply File, Export, 2D graphic. You might want to send it into layout, but that's what we're going to be dealing with on Monday when we create geometry in SketchUp, but we use layout to gather all the different views and elevations, which are a little bit more technical, but express the information that contractors want to use and allow you to start adding dimensions. So exporting, and then you have a choice of exporting JPEG, TIFF, PDF, however you see yourself making those presentations and pulling them together. With a white background, it always looks better, in my opinion. Right, I'm over. Sorry for going on a bit. I hope that was useful. It was a whirlwind tour of how to set up a simple model for presentation. Several of you emailed me yesterday with follow-on questions. So again, today I'm happy. I'm not a help desk, so I don't promise to respond within 12 hours, and it is the weekend, but I really do try to get to all questions as they come in. I look forward to seeing you again on Monday, and in the meantime, have a great weekend.